Hello and welcome to Pages of Godlight podcast. I'm your host, Christine Whitaker. Have you ever seen how sunlight breaks through a patch of trees and creates a circle of brightness that seems almost otherworldly? C.S. Lewis described these as patches of Godlight. My hope is in this podcast, you too will stumble upon bright spots of words and carefully delivered messages that open you up to experiencing the light that is all around us and waiting to be found.
It's all good.
It was nice to visit with you a bit.
I know. We realize in family businesses, it's DIY. So you roll with it, right?
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to get into it. But is there anything you want to cover, Brad, too? Like, is there any question you'd like me to ask you? Because I'm more than happy to cover. If there's something you have on your heart to share, I can lead into that.
I think you've covered it, but I'll just review the things that are organized in my head. So one is, from my personal experience, both the traumatic and the liberating versions of deconstruction. Second, an impetus for the book being watching the hand-wringing pastors and the cheerleading influencers and being concerned about the lack of empathy in both cases, and that's where to start. And then later on, when you're asking about what do you want us to know, that's where I would go into let's really give ourselves to a living connection. That I think actually the future of faith is a living connection with God and one another, because if you don't, you'll look elsewhere. And I think alternatives like Christian nationalism, I don't know if you want me to go there at all, but it seems to me that's one place you go. If you don't have a living connection, what's religion about then? Well, domination or power or so, but that people if they're just patient, they can find belonging again, and that even a mystical sense of oneness with God. So that's sort of where I want to end up, with living presence or communion as the end game.
Maybe we can get into that vulnerability, because the things that I really liked, Brad, that I had to talk about was what your wife said and what David Goa said about, scars and wounding and just picking at the scabs versus letting the healing come. Maybe that can be the place to talk about vulnerability of how we do the healing. So so let me just open, and then we'll just start by kind of describing what are we talking about in deconstruction. And then I think I'm going to say, in your book, you say, I believe in deconstruction. And then I think that can lead you into your story, because that can help give the narrative for that. If that
sounds good.
Okay. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to another episode of Pages of Godlight, and I'm so excited to have Brad Jersak with me, author of Out of the Embers. Brad, thank you so much for being with us. I'm excited to talk to you about a very big topic, a very wide topic, sometimes a very dark topic of deconstruction. And you are a voice in this, and I think you've handled it with a lot of empathy, a lot of understanding, a lot of personal experience. So before we get into all of that, I think everyone has a different interpretation of what deconstruction even is, and I'm sure we could spend 30 minutes just talking on that. But maybe you can start by what is your definition of deconstruction, and you also call it the Great Deconstruction, and maybe you can explain a little bit about that too.
Sure. You're right. Many people have contributed to definitions, but I want to start with the root word, construct. So it's my sense that all of us have constructs of God and faith, notions, ideas, and that those constructs aren't God per se, God as such. The constructs are our interpretation in this moment of God. And so deconstruction is when we begin to question the constructs we've developed or inherited. And in addressing those constructs critically, we find that some of them begin to fall away. Now, whether that falling away ends up in losing our faith or a much deeper intimacy with God depends on the person's journey. But that's a really simple definition. It's when we begin to question our constructs of God, whether they've developed internally or been given to us through a church indoctrination, family of origin, and so on. I call this the Great Deconstruction because we've hit a real wave of it, such that it's observable demographically. So people like the Pew poll, for example, they can measure how many people have stopped going to churches, and they can also see how many have shifted from identifying as Christian to ex-Christian, or nuns and duns, we call them, the non-affiliated, or done with church or Christianity. And the demographics on that are so dramatic in the last 10 to 20 years that really it needs to be addressed. And it is being addressed by authors, by social media, by influencers. Everyone has an angle on this, it seems, and I do too. So that's what the book was about.
Well, I think also it's, depends on who you are and how you feel about that word. Sometimes that's seen very negatively, sometimes it's seen positively. And in the book, you sort of say, I believe in deconstruction. And I think there's certainly value to questioning what your constructs are, because how do we come to truth without doing that? If we're blindly following whatever, how do we really know that we're on the right track? So maybe speak into why you believe in deconstruction. And I know you clarified that in the book about what that means for you, but I also know it's very personal to you too.
Sure. Yeah. So I would say that there's different binaries here. One of them is this. For some, deconstruction is completely involuntary. It's just a thing that happens to them. They find themselves questioning and they can't help it, and they find themselves losing their old way of seeing, and there's nothing they can do to unwind that. And often that will come through traumatic experiences where they begin to question whether they trust God or not, and I'll get into that in a moment. But also it can be very voluntary. It's where through careful study and research and curiosity, we begin to realize, oh, I can let go of certain things and I don't have to believe what I believed. And when we start experiencing that, that can also be very liberating. So I have an advantage in that I've experienced both. So in the very positive side, the liberating side, my deconstruction was theological, where I began to revisit the scriptures to assess what I had believed and been taught about the nature of God. And the more thoroughly I've done that, the more I've come to see God's love and God's grace and God's mercy as his very character. And the more I began to question theologies of retribution, where God is the, angry or punitive or retributive. And interestingly, for me, that's liberating to my soul, but I actually discovered it in the depths of the ancient church. So it's not like I had to let go of Christian theology to have the liberation of seeing God's grace. It's actually where I found it. What I let go of was more modern construct. So all of that was super liberating and quite voluntary. I mean, I needed to do it, but it wasn't like I was undergoing this thing. On the other hand, I also went through severe trauma through the late 2000s, 2008, and that was involuntary and it was traumatic, and it involved a lot of friends dying. We led a church that included people with disabilities, a lot of sudden deaths with them. We had people who were in the recovery community, and we had overdose deaths and a gruesome murder. In a small church, we had a young woman who went off to do missions in Central America, and she was abducted and abused, and all of this was happening at once. And then we had some scandal in our church, and I just began to unravel, and I unraveled into my own acting out in addictions. And it was just, at one point, I'm like, for the first time in my life, I didn't know if I could trust God. So I had to resign. I said, our church is way too vulnerable right now. And so I stepped back, and wisely, the board asked my wife to step in, and she led a healing journey for the church and with me. So that too was a deconstruction, but it was scary to like, I don't remember not trusting God before. I've been angry at God before, but like, what do I do with this? And I think that's not something I could control or manage. I mean, I managed it only by going to 12-step recovery and having good mentors, spiritual directors, sponsors who really watched over me, and I couldn't have got through that without them. It was dark, and like you say, I mean, for me, just full disclosure, it involved suicidal ideations, and here's a guy who'd been pastoring for 20 years, so. But I came through it because we had a community that loved me, and instead of rejecting me in my deconstruction, which so many do, they actually gathered around me in love, and that was a key to my healing. So I had both these things going, and they intersect there. They intersect in the mercy of God. I had a theology and an experience of divine mercy that is a real experience for me rather than a head game.
And I feel that empathy you have for people going through this that don't have support. They've maybe left their church, or their family are not believers, or they don't have friends that have faith. And so they're left on their own devices to try to figure out how do I deconstruct healthily? How do I find truth? And there's lots of voices in the world, and some are good and some are bad when it comes to that. And I think you address that well in the book of how to find the right support, especially if you've been through trauma of some sort. And I think maybe you can talk a little bit, Brad, because I think also when we talk about deconstruction, there's such a gamut of what that looks like for different people. Some it's simply maybe doubting things or maybe starting to question certain things that have been, on their mind. It might just be simply from a place of doubt, versus someone that's gone through intense loss or trauma or something that they never thought they would go through, that they have no answers for. And I know when people lose someone, especially in a violent way or in just a very tragic way, you question how could this happen? Why did it happen? And there's no easy answer for that. I mean, I'm sure you can attest even today when you've come through a lot of things, you still don't have answers for some of those things. And so I just thought maybe you could speak to that gamut, and like also as people outside of maybe deconstruction, how we can have better empathy for that gamut of different ways people are going through this.
Yeah, that's such a good question. So when we talk about the gamut, what I'm imagining in my head is the range of reactions when people start asking questions. And we, historically, the church has made asking questions and doubting seem like a sin, seem like a deficiency rather than something to be welcomed. So on the one end of that range, I do see what I call hand-wringing pastors who are really worried about the questions that are arising, the doubts that are being expressed, and trying to put a lid on it. And the reality is you can't. And in fact, if you resist the doubt and the questions as if they're a moral failing, you will actually energize them and drive people out. Okay, and so now people start not showing up for church, and the pastor's like, how is this going to affect tithing, frankly? And but if even just in their heart, it's like, here's people I've discipled into faith, and now it looks like they're drifting away from it. And so there's a real temptation then to exert control, to argue, or even from a place of compassion to give platitudes and to try to come up with solutions to the problem of evil that will be that seem philosophically satisfying, but they don't touch a heart that is hurting. And so so that's the one end where deconstruction is even called it's treated like a threat, or worse, and that can happen both from pastoral leadership, but within families as well, where a spouse, for example, can begin feeling very insecure. Is my spouse losing their faith? What will this mean for our children? And I've had more than one person say to me, I just started questioning eternal conscious torment in a lake of fire, and my spouse said, if you don't stop it, I'm leaving you and taking the children. I'm like, why would you break up a family over a theological debate? I mean, but that's how threatening it feels, right? On the other end, I saw a lot of the deconstruction gurus on social media and on podcasting where they celebrate deconstruction, and well, okay. At one level, they're wanting to affirm the questioning, they're wanting to affirm the journey, but some of them, it was just like cheerleaders waving pom-poms and saying things like, you're doing exactly what you need to do, it's wonderful, burn it all down. And I'm like, wait a minute, burn it all down? That's what Dostoevsky called like spiritual arson, and cheering on, like, you're doing exactly what you need to do, you are being exactly who you need to be. But meanwhile, a lot of them were hurting, and they're like, you're cheering for me, but I'm like in the psych ward with this stuff. I'm in torment. No one's listening to that my doubts are painful, and you're just saying, yeah, follow your heart. And I watched a lot of them follow their hearts right out of their marriages and families, churches and communities, into deep isolation and alienation. And I'm like, you've not heard them. And in fact, it's way too, in the old sense of evangelical, it's way too evangelical in that they wanted and expected these poor folks to be a testimony of successful deconstruction, where they're like, I'm not your good testimony. I'm dying here. And then what happens? They get silenced and shut down. And it's like, your testimony of unraveling is not welcome because it didn't affirm our narrative that, where deconstruction becomes its own God. And so that's the two extremes, right? The hand-wringing pastors trying to shut it down, the cheerleaders trying to burn it down. And in the middle of that, I asked my godfather, David Goa, like, what do we do? And he goes, start with empathy, non-judgmental listening, whether you're a pastor, a family member, or a friend. And the hardest thing for me is when I hear things that to me sound like lies coming out of their mouths.
Right.
Like, God failed me. And I'm like, did he though? But so what I have to resist then is I have to resisting the lament. They're lamenting. These are like the Psalms. The Psalms are about deconstruction and the way God handles it. God, the Holy Spirit who inspired those Psalms, lets them talk it out. Lets the lament come forth. In fact, the book of Lamentations is like that, where God doesn't even get to answer. In the book of Lamentations, they make God listen, and he does. And because he does, these people who are deeply deconstructing conclude, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. How did they get there? It's like, because he listened. And I want to be that kind of person. I'm trying to be. I needed that, and I found it in my mentors.
And I think it seems to me like the underlying in your book is patience. Patience. God is a patient God. I mean, he's eternal, so we're a pebble in the spectrum of time, right? But that patience of like people walking through anger, walking through grief, walking through the things that we need to walk through, but having people that not only listen, but continually listen, because it's not like you listen once and they're going to be healed. And this one line in the book Brad, really, really spoke to me. And I think you can speak to this about trauma, because there are a lot of people that have been through all degrees of trauma. But I thought this was so poignant. You say traumatic events can't be undone, but traumatic narratives can be rewritten. My past can be retold as my unfolding story of redemption. And I think that rewriting narratives is part of the deconstruction. That's like the hopeful part of getting through something painful. So speak a little bit to that, because that even, I mean, you went through trauma yourself and had to rewrite your own narrative.
Yeah, sure. So let's start with this phrase. I got this from Father John Bear, one of my teachers. He talked about the long becoming. So we're on a journey that is a long becoming, that and patience really helps there, doesn't it? So I have a neighbor who lives across the street from me, and he came over to talk about the book as I was rewriting it, and he reminded me of the language of reframing. So we reframe a narrative. I can give you a very simple example. I grew up, I'm going to share two narratives very quickly. So here's the first narrative. I grew up in a conservative Baptist church that introduced me to hellfire preaching, moralistic revivalists, and the constant fear of being left behind and going through the Great Tribulation with the Antichrist in Armageddon. And that context was crazy making. Okay, that's the first narrative. Now I've come through like healing, and I can go back and reframe those early years. And here's my narrative today. None of that is untrue. But before I heard my first hellfire sermon, I learned the name of Jesus on my mother's knee, and I've loved him every day since then. She taught me that when I prayed, he was this close to me, and even closer. And I've experienced that presence my whole life, even through my deconstruction. And as much as I've had to reframe how I read scripture, I take it much more seriously now, because I've always loved the way God speaks to me and reveals himself through that book, more so now than ever. So I'm able to honor my story and integrate my story into who I am today, instead of treating it as like this thing that had to die. So that's an example of shifting narratives.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Pages of Godlight. To find out more information about the books we feature in each episode and the authors behind them, visit pagesofgodlight.com. Let there be abundant light.